Hey everybody, and thanks for tuning into this virtual presentation. My name is Michael Bossetta, and I'm Assistant Professor in Communication and Media at Lund University, and I'll be presenting my PhD thesis published last year entitled The Digital Architectures of Social Media, Platforms and Participation in Contemporary Politics. And the main argument of that thesis is that the design of a social media platform shapes user behavior that takes place within it. So this falls within the field of political communication, where we tend to look at the information and communication flows between three actor types: political actors, media actors, and citizens. And increasingly, that communication is mediated by social media platforms. So existing research in this area tends to look at two overarching theories, most notably the idea of affordances, which are action possibilities enabled by a platform, and social media logics, which examines the modes of information production and distribution on social media platforms vis-a-vis mainstream media. And keeping with affordances, because this is the most widely used theory, it's the idea that certain action possibilities can be enabled through design. So buttons enable pushing, switches afford flipping, and knobs can be rotated. And my argument is that instead of looking at these outcome actions, we should really focus on how the design of particular features of those platforms influence those outcome actions. So if we think about this in the context of politics, we can look at how the design features of Facebook's ad targeting can influence political campaigning, or how certain things such as hashtags can enable protest mobilization. So the overarching research question here is, how do the digital architectures of social media platforms mediate practices of political communication? And I define digital architectures as the technical protocols that facilitate, constrain, and shape user behavior in a virtual space. So one of the chapters is a really early look at what digital architectures are, where we compared the key differences between Facebook and Twitter and what that means for citizens' participation in European politics. So we looked at things like how are the networks different, differences between how connections are established and maintained. We looked at differences in the algorithms, how these algorithms influence how far a post can cascade across a platform, and how these features connectively draw certain types of user demographics to the platform, with Facebook being more representative of the general population and Twitter being used more for elite communication, particularly in Europe. And so we used a couple of empirical examples that were going on in Europe at the time, such as Je suis Charlie and the migrant crisis, and basically made the argument that on Facebook, these design features lead to a type of showing of moral solidarity, whereas Twitter was used more for breaking news and engaging in partisan discussion around elections. We also examined what type of engagement is possible on the platforms, and we argued that Facebook is more of a forum for commenting based on groups and subscription to pages, whereas Twitter is more of a forum for not so much engaging actively with the platform, but turning to it for information and fulfilling a need for cognition. So the main theoretical argument of the thesis is in this article, which seeks to expand that typology, compare more platforms, look at the context of the 2016 US election and political campaigning in particular, where it's highly professionalized and there's a massive amount of resources invested, and combine interviews with some digital strategists with data that comes from the platforms themselves. And so I conducted interviews with a number of leading Republican digital strategists from the Rand Paul, Rubio, Walker, and Trump campaigns. These are all openly accessible as part of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Definitely check that out if you haven't already. There's a lot of great material that deals with research on this topic. I'm going to skip over data collection for now in the interest of time. But basically what I did is looked at 4 key elements that were identified as crucial for understanding digital architectures. One is the network structure, how connections between accounts are created, established, and maintained. Another one looks at functionality. This is how content is produced and distributed across a platform. Third is the role of algorithms and how political actors can override those algorithms by paying to promote. And the last is datafication, which deals with matching voter files to users on the back end of the platform, targeting them, and what type of data analytics can be pulled from these advertisements in a way that optimizes campaign strategy. So if we take just one example, I know it's hard to read in this format, but what does it mean that Snapchat is only accessible on a mobile device? Well, Eric Wilson, Marco Rubio's digital director, told me that the unique thing about Snapchat is it has to be done right there. You couldn't at the time upload images or videos to the platform, and that means that most of the Snapchatting was done by the candidate's body man, who is responsible for making sure the candidate gets from A to B, and how the snapping was done was very much up to that individual, and that differed across campaigns. So crucially, the candidate loses the ability to control their image in this type of immediate format, which relates to the specific design choice that it must be on a mobile device. Every other platform aside from Snapchat could be accessed from a desktop, and what this means is that politicians can't take their snaps and filter them and release them at strategic time points during the campaign. It has to be done right there, and it can't be filtered. So if we look at what example of this and what it looks like, on the left you have a snap, and on the right you have a photo from Instagram from the same campaign event. And what you'll see is that on the left, that supporters aren't really, waving their signs, right? This is before the rally started. Whereas on the right, you have a sort of picture-perfect image of the candidate, great lighting, it's been filtered. You have the moment where everyone's engaged in the campaign. And so this is just a simple example that shows how candidates can be more in control based on design features from the platform. And what's interesting is this also has some ramifications for information that can be disseminated to their followers based on the immediacy of the platform. So if we look at Snapchat, we see that they write that there's 2,500 people in attendance, whereas on Instagram, after they've had some time to correct information, they mention that it's 4,000 users. So it's just an interesting example that shows how, particularly relating to the fact that Snapchat is on a smartphone, this has ramifications for the type of content that campaigns can produce in terms of their image control, but also in terms of their information. So I did a very basic content analysis, just comparing Facebook and Instagram to see what content was similar or different across the platforms. And so the proportion of bars in black shows content that was specific to Instagram, whereas the dark gray bars are content that was the exact same across Facebook and Instagram, both the image or video and the caption associated with it. And the light gray bars are the same image or video with a different caption, usually changed to add a hyperlink, which you can't do on Instagram. And so what we see is that for 3 of the 5 campaigns, over half of the content they posted on Instagram was not unique to that platform. And I think existing research that's coming out now is arguing that the affordances of platforms will incentivize campaigns to produce different content. But at the same time, if the architectures allow for similar content, then we may see campaigns recycle the same messages across platforms to either reach a broader audience or simply due to resource constraints. And I have another presentation in this conference where we look at this with some more advanced methodologies. All right, so what are the findings from this study? Well, a substantial portion of the same political messages were distributed across platforms. We could find examples of every content from every platform being distributed on every other platform, whether it's a screenshot of a tweet or a snap being uploaded on Instagram. And this relates to what is allowed by the architecture. All of them allow video up to 10 seconds. That's Snapchat's limitation. Facebook allows for 45-minute videos, whereas Instagram, I think at the time, was 2. So these differences in formats do have ramifications for what campaigns can communicate, whether it's short form, long form, text, video, boomerangs, whatever it is. Also found that Facebook was dominant in 2016. That's no real surprise, but what's interesting is that you can conceptualize this directly along this typology. Accounts are easy to find on Facebook. This relates to connecting networks between citizens and politicians. Hyperlinking, which is key for fundraising in the United States, is highly enabled by Facebook, also Twitter, but not Instagram or Snapchat. The ability to override algorithms and pay to promote is key for politicians who are looking to reach audiences outside of their user base. And the same goes for matching, targeting, and analytics. Facebook has the best tools. Instagram uses the same tools as Facebook, and therefore campaigns are incentivized to spend money there because they get high quality analytics out of those targeting and A/B testing. And lastly, kind of interesting because this was the first time both Instagram and Snapchat were used in an election. Instagram adoption was more prevalent than Snapchat, but we can explain this by the architectures. Snapchat had limitations for campaigns in terms of its hardware exclusivity, being only accessible on a mobile device, and Instagram's datafication suite, because it's owned by Facebook, was much more powerful. Snapchat was not able to deliver campaigns with good metrics that they could measure their return on investment. Okay. So that's one element of the thesis. And then I've also looked at two studies that examine British citizens' political participation in the context of the 2015 British general election on Twitter and the 2016 Brexit referendum in the United States. So looking at the Twitter study first, I'm just going to briefly present it here. We looked at the conversations around this hashtag. I think it was 500,000 tweets. We found that citizens, not political parties, were the most active actors in promoting calls to action, which is kind of interesting because you'd think that politicians and parties would be the most active in getting out the vote. But we found citizens taking up this role, and particularly citizens who were supporters of nationalist parties, such as UKIP and the SNP. They were the most active. They were retweeting each other, so they were coordinated, and they were tech savvy in using hashtags, whereas other supporters really didn't do that so much. So we interpret this as that these citizens, these nationalist supporters, were leveraging the architecture of Twitter to promote visibility and encourage mobilization for their cause. Looking at Facebook and the Brexit referendum, we traced users' their user IDs across whether they posted to specific pages that were produced by the respective campaigns for the referendum. And we also looked at political stories in the media. Basically, we wanted to know whether we could see if citizens were influenced to comment on the media because they were triggered by partisan messaging, or was it the other way around, that citizens first got involved with the campaigns and then sort of took those messages into the media comments. And this is just a look at the data. So these are the campaigns we looked at, the official Stronger In and Vote Leave, but also Leave EU, which was an unofficial campaign mostly associated with Nigel Farage. And again, we see these sort of hardline nationalist supporters as the most active, both in raw numbers of unique commenters, but in particular, their comment count. And then here we have the media. These are specifically political stories posted by the media over a year and a half around the referendum. And we'll see the Times, it was hidden behind a paywall, so it didn't have much interaction there. But what's interesting, I think the most interesting part of this study is we looked at when a new commenter was engaged in the debate, did they first post to the media or did they first post to the political campaign pages? And actually overall, we found a very, very small amount of users who posted across both types of pages. But what we do find is that except for the month of and after the referendum, citizens tend to comment on the media first, which we interpret as the media still having an agenda-setting role within online discussions. So looking at these two cases, which are the same national context, but an election and a referendum and across Facebook and Twitter, we see in both cases that nationalist voices are the most active and coordinated, and that particularly the architectures matter. On Twitter, these users leverage hashtags to promote their reach to a general audience, and particularly those focused on the GE 2015 hashtag, whereas on Facebook, we have a different architecture of dedicated pages where users can go and comment, which is a different visibility dynamic. And what we found in follow-up research is that 90% of the comments on the Remain page were actually left by leavers. So this is not to support that echo chamber hypothesis. It basically shows that leavers brought their message into Remain pages, so Remainers saw it, and leavers obviously were exposed to Remain messages by being in those spaces. So wrapping everything up, this is kind of the overall output of the thesis is the digital architectures framework. And I'm just going to go through it briefly here, where we have on the back end, where the social media developers and designers work with those programs, I think we can argue that there are logics there. We have a logic of programmability, that these digital architectures are open to change, and programmers change them based on the data they receive from users. So there's a logic of programmability, and there's a logic of datafication, and those are mediated through APIs that both allow developers to harvest large amounts of data, but then optimize their platforms in ways that, based on how they interpret the data, right? This is kind of the power of these platforms. So on the front end, this is where users are engaged. And there we have the networks, the functions they're allowed to do, the algorithms that either promote or stunt the visibility of their messages, and the data they create. And so we can think of architectures as the bridge, because there's a system design on the back end that the programmers are basically developing so that users can engage with on the front end. And the link between these two is the users produce data by interacting with the functions, and the programmers take this and they iterate the design of the platform from there. And so as a result of this interaction between users and developers, there are affordances that are generated, right? Networks generate the ability to connect and establish relationships. The available functions and features that are designed allows for content production and distribution within the certain parameters that developers put in. And lastly, algorithms influence the reach and visibility of content. So we have a sort of interplay at the level of system architecture and front-end architecture that together I would call digital architecture. And these architectures enable affordances. And that's it. So you can read a copy of the thesis on my website, and feel free to get in touch with any questions. Thanks for watching.